Well, hi. It's great to be with you all this morning. Um, Flannery O'Connor said a story is a way of saying something that can't be said in any other way. I'm going to tell you a story. So there's pictures, but I'm going to tell you a story. The bulk of this time together is going to be a story about which you know something, and that is, it's the story of how Vincent Van Gogh came to cut off his ear. People know a couple of things about Vincent if they know anything, and they know that he painted Starry Night and that he cut off his ear. And then there are other things they kind of have a sense of. My hope today is that if you are a person who has gotten a good chuckle out of Vincent cutting off his ear at various points in your life, that you will have enjoyed that, and then it would end today. So, but this story is a true story, and it's also a bit of a parable. And so we're just going to get right into it. Oh, if I could have worked without this accursed disease, what things I might have done. Vincent Van Gogh. In the late 1990s, I was living in St. Louis, and a special art exhibition came through the St. Louis Art Museum, and I remember going. It was a collection of a few Van Goghs, and then a lot of other works by painters that he had inspired. And they were arranged in this part of the gallery on these temporary walls that guided us through something of a narrative. And so we did what you do in museums, and that is that we entered by the coat check, and we made our way through this little labyrinth of panels and paintings and learning about his brilliance and his influence, and then we exited through the gift shop. And the gift shop had some posters and prints and postcards of the paintings that were in the show, but largely it was composed of tchotchkes, making light of Vincent's episode with his severed ear, which had nothing to do with the exhibition. But you could buy a lapel pin in the shape of an ear, you could buy an eraser in the shape of an ear, or you could buy a thermal coffee mug that bore Vincent's portrait with a note beside it that explained, when you pour in a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes before your eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. And it broke my heart. It still does. It's personal for me with Vincent, as you may discover. Most of us, our greatest shame and our deepest hurts are closely guarded secrets, known only to a few, if any. And the reason for that, the reason we protect these parts of ourselves is not because they're shameful, but because they're sacred. What if the story of Vincent Van Gogh cutting off his ear isn't really that funny? What happened here, which is undoubtedly one of the lowest points in an already tortured artist's soul, helps us see not just his shame, but also the hope that surrounds that shame. And it shows us that in the end, we are not our worst moments. We're not our biggest failures. It teaches us the sacred work of stewarding one another's pain, which is, if you're going to be a friend with anybody, part of the role of a friend is to steward the other's pain. And it bids us, be gentle, because this is a hard world. October 23, 1888, a train pulls into the station in Arles, France, 5 a.m. And a man in a black suit steps out onto the platform, and he lets his eyes begin to adjust. He takes a suitcase from the porter. He studies the map on the wall by the ticket window. And he says, okay, 1 block south and then a quick left to the square, and then 1 block over. The address that he's looking for is 2 Place Lamartine, and it was at the northeast corner of the square. The 2-story house was shuttered, and all was quiet in the square except for the faint din of activity coming from around the corner. And so following the sound, the man saw light spilling out onto the street from the Café de la Gare, known to the locals as the Café de Nuit, or the Night Café. Night cafes in France were 24-hour establishments where, as Vincent Van Gogh said, night prowlers can take refuge when they have no money to pay for lodging or are too drunk to be taken in. The outer walls of the Café de Nuit were lined with marble-topped tables, and in the back there was a simple, well-stocked bar, and in the center of the room there was a large green billiard table, and there were a few customers, night prowlers slumped over their drinks waiting for day. The proprietor, a tidy man in a white suit named Joseph Michel Genoux, emerged from the back, and he took one look at his new arrival, and he said, "Ah, you must be Monsieur Gauguin. Welcome." And the man looked at him curiously, and Genoux explained, "Your host showed me the picture that you sent. And he said I might find you in need of refreshment. What can I get you?" Well, the sun wouldn't be up for another couple of hours, and so Gauguin settled down at a table. And then at first light, he paid Genoux, he thanked him, and then he went around the corner and he found the house just as his host had described it, butter yellow with green shutters, which were now open. Gauguin knocked and he waited. And then the quick patter of footsteps came down the stairs like the sound of a man running, and an excited but anxious Vincent Van Gogh opened the door. Van Gogh scholar Martin Gayford said, "Gauguin's arrival was, it is safe to say, among the most exhilarating but also the most anxious moments of Vincent's life. No sooner had he signed the lease for the Yellow House, almost 6 months before, than Vincent had started to evolve a plan. He didn't want to live in the house alone. He desperately yearned for company. Right from the start, Gauguin had come to mind as the ideal companion." Gauguin's arrival was more than just a visit from a friend. The two barely knew each other. But his presence, which took a lot of persistence and cajoling on Vincent's part, and which had been delayed several times for a variety of reasons that made Vincent wonder if Gauguin even really wanted to come at all, represented a crucial step toward Vincent's dream of an artist colony in the south of France. Neither Vincent nor Gauguin were considered successful artists at this point. But both of them had, through different though similar circumstances, committed themselves to being painters as a vocation. And so, after working as a missionary for a time, an art dealer, Vincent tried his hand at painting, and he started painting in earnest at the age of 27. He was immediately taken by the sensuality and the mystery of what the infinite combinations of color and composition could produce. And his letters that he wrote were just filled with so much enthusiasm and curiosity and reverence and swagger and zeal for the craft of painting that it would be hard for him to imagine doing anything else. As for Gauguin, the Yellow House was more of a strategic move for somebody who had limited options. In 1873, at the age of 25, Gauguin had married a Danish woman from Copenhagen named Sophie Gad, and with her they had 5 children. Gauguin struggled professionally. His professional struggles combined with this desire to paint fractured his marriage. And in 1885, Sophie urged Gauguin to move to Paris, and she and the children would just stay back with her family in Copenhagen. And so Gauguin struggled to make his way back into the artistic community in Paris. He lived in poverty that first year, producing just a few works. The following year, he moved to an artist colony in Brittany on the Atlantic coast, and he found unexpected success and admiration among the younger artists who gathered there in the summers. And coastal life really suited him. He liked it. It was cheap. It ran at a slow pace. And so he resumed painting there, and he took up also the sports of fencing and boxing. And he became quite proficient, especially as a boxer. In 1887, Gauguin moved across the Atlantic to Panama and then to the Caribbean island of Martinique. While he was in Panama, interestingly, he was on a work crew helping to dig the Panama Canal. So he was involved in that as one of the workers. He went to the Martinique and he painted around 20 paintings while he was there in those islands. He came back to France and he showed these paintings at an art gallery, and they were seen by Vincent Van Gogh and his brother Theo. Theo ran an art dealership and he purchased 3 of Gauguin's paintings. He really liked them. He purchased 3 of them to display in his dealership. And so Goupil's was the name of this dealership, and those being on display in that art store brought visibility not just to the paintings, but to the painter as well. And this was new for him. Gauguin's relationship with Goupil was instrumental in his decision to join Vincent in Arles. It kind of worked this way. Once Vincent had convinced Gauguin, once Vincent was convinced that Gauguin would be a great partner for his brotherhood of painters in the South, he pleaded with Theo to make Gauguin an offer that he just wouldn't be able to refuse. And that offer would be free food and lodging in exchange for pictures for as long as he lived in the Yellow House with Vincent. And so this gave Gauguin a place to live. It guaranteed that his work would be seen and offered for sale and sold. And he would become known by art collectors and art dealers. And the only catch was they had to live with Vincent Van Gogh. Vincent and Gauguin got to know each other through correspondence, which for Gauguin was a way for him to develop and refine his philosophy and approach to art. They wrote a lot about their view of art, and Gauguin used this to kind of really refine that. But for Vincent, it really was an opportunity for him to exchange letters with a painter that he really admired. And so in their relationship, Gauguin was the one who was trying to figure out how to earn a living as a painter, and Vincent was the one who was trying to figure out how to live as a painter. He wasn't primarily interested in how Gauguin's influence would elevate his notoriety or success. He just wanted Gauguin's friendship, and he wanted the inspiration that the two could draw off of each other. And those were different goals. And these different goals made for their friendship to be a volatile chemistry. And that volatility was there even before Gauguin's train pulled into the station, because it made Gauguin dodgy about when he would come and how long he would stay. And it left Vincent anxious about his arrival and feeling like he really needed to please him, because what if Gauguin hated Arles? What if he found the pastoral countryside uninspiring? What if he felt like he had been deceived by Vincent and really came to resent him? They wrote these letters back and forth, and they decided that they would exchange pictures of themselves, self-portraits. And this was actually how Janus was able to recognize Gauguin. Each man had created a new self-portrait especially for this occasion, for their meeting. And they seemed to have agreed to tie their portraits to literature as a way of revealing to one another a bit of their own personalities and passions. Martin Gayford said this. He said, the pictures were indices of how Gauguin and Van Gogh imagined themselves. Each had presented his image in character as a figure from literature, and one thing they had in common was an intense fantasy life in which their own real lives merged with their reading. Maybe some of you know what it's like for your real life to merge with your reading. Gauguin painted himself as Jean Valjean from Les Mis. He presented himself to the world as an outcast, as a martyr, as a hero, as a leader of a band of rebels, maybe a nod to the Impressionists and fancying himself as one of their leaders. And he wrote to Vincent in his portrait these words. He said, it is, I love this, it is the face of an outlaw, ill-clad and powerful like Jean Valjean, with an inner nobility and gentleness. The face is flushed, the eyes accented by the surrounding color of a furnace fire, This is to represent the volcanic flames that animate the soul of the artist. The girlish background with its childlike flowers is there to attest to our artistic purity. As for this Jean Valjean whom society has oppressed, cast out, is he not equally a symbol of the contemporary impressionist painter? In endowing myself with his features, I offer you as well an image of myself, a portrait of all the wretched victims of society. Vincent sent Gauguin a portrait of himself with close-cropped hair and subtly slanted eyes, giving himself the look of a Japanese monk. He got this idea from Pierre Loti's novel, Madame Chrysanthemum, which was later adopted into the opera Madame Butterfly, about French military officers stationed off the coast of Japan, in which there are Buddhist monks, and they play a small role in the story. But to Gauguin, Vincent wrote this about his portrait. If we study Japanese art, we see a man who is undoubtedly wise, philosophic, intelligent, who spends his time doing what? He studies a single blade of grass. But the blade of grass leads him to draw every plant, and then the seasons, the wide aspects of the countryside, and then animals, and then the human figure. Come now, isn't it almost a true religion these simple Japanese people teach us, who live in nature as though they themselves were flowers? Perhaps Vincent chose the likeness of a monk to convey a posture of submission to his French veteran guest, or maybe he was trying to say that he was a person Gauguin could expect to be contemplative and austere. But either way, neither man was really like the portrait that they sent. Gauguin was not the hero of a band of rebels, and Vincent could be really volatile and manic. And so when Gauguin knocked on Vincent's door, both men had ideas of what they hoped to get out of this artistic union. And both of them worried that they might disappoint the other, or that they might not hold up their end. And so their portraits were forerunners. They were attempts to prepare the other for who they hoped to be once they came together. But people are who they are. And though we might try to frame ourselves in a certain light, drawing attention to our better qualities, once we let somebody get close enough to us, they will see what we left out, what we tried to hide. They will see those unflattering truths that have become so familiar to us that we don't really notice they're there until we notice somebody else noticing them. Vincent took great care and deliberation in decorating the Yellow House. From the art on the walls, to the yellow linens and curtains, to the green paint on the shutters, to the furniture that he accumulated over time, he'd been renting part of the Yellow House as his studio since May of that year. And he had just leased the remaining bedrooms in September. He said, I have it all planned. I really do want to make it an artist's studio, an artist's house, not affected. On the contrary, nothing affected, but everything from the chairs to the pictures on the wall full of character. Vincent showed Gauguin around, and he pointed out canvases that he had painted. Gauguin's small room featured 6 of these paintings that Vincent had done for him, 4 landscapes of local gardens and 2 pots of sunflowers. Other works decorated Vincent's bedroom and the hallways, but as they moved from room to room, Gauguin was surprised to find that there were actually paintings everywhere, stacked on the floor. Vincent was engaged in one of the most astonishing creative sprints in Western art at the time. During his 15 months in Arles, he produced around 200 canvases. Many of them considered his master works, like Starry Night over the River Rhone, the Night Cafe, the Cafe Terrace, Vase with 15 sunflowers, the Sower, pair of shoes, and the Red Vineyard, the only painting Vincent sold during his lifetime. Most of them were stacked in the yellow house when Gauguin arrived, and the scene must have been simultaneously impressive and disconcerting, evidence of creative insatiability and a manic compulsion to produce at a pace and volume nobody had ever seen. Vincent's downstairs studio where he produced these works was a chaotic mess. Gauguin recalled in a letter, "I was shocked. His boxes of colors barely sufficed to contain all those squeezed tubes which were never closed up." All told, Gauguin spent 63 days with Vincent in Arles, just over 2 months. And they were two of the most productive months of each artist's career, and they were also two of the most turbulent. Vincent treated Gauguin as his superior. He even came to resent Gauguin's tone of superiority, even though he granted it to him. And that tone came across as really critical and magisterial. Vincent felt that Gauguin regarded him as a rival, even though he didn't feel that he was a rival, that Gauguin would deliberately try to goad him into anger, and he struggled to control his temper, and he argued back with a stubbornness all his own. And so during their time together, it was tough. Gauguin assumed control of their partnership. He planned their days, he cooked their meals, he managed their money, even down to how the two of them would pay the women at the brothels. And Vincent quickly came to depend on Gauguin as though he was the guest and Gauguin was the host. And one historian wrote this. He said, Vincent's emotional attachment to Gauguin became so strong that whenever Gauguin threatened to leave, Vincent became agitated, fearful of isolation, once even hurling a glass of absinthe at his friend. Vincent and Gauguin were, on many occasions, heavy drinkers. When Vincent drank, his behavior became even more mercurial than when he was sober. And one afternoon, Vincent and Gauguin sat silently in Genou's cafe, and they'd been arguing over art and politics, and they'd been at it for so long that they eventually just stopped talking. And then, without warning, Vincent hurled his glass of absinthe at Gauguin's head. Gauguin dodged the glass, but then he grabbed Vincent by the collar and he dragged him out into the street, and Gauguin, the boxer, was ready to go. But he couldn't bear to strike his glassy-eyed associate, and so he went back into the cafe, and Vincent shuffled home, and he passed out until the next day, and he woke up the following morning confused, claiming to have a vague memory of assaulting his friend, and he begged Gauguin's forgiveness, and Gauguin replied that he did not mind at all. This is what he wrote in a letter, that he was accustomed to much rougher treatment. If, however, one of those absinthe glasses should happen to hit him, he was not prepared to answer for the consequences. After that, Gauguin decided that it was time for them to part ways. And so he wrote to Theo, Vincent's brother, to let him know. But Vincent pleaded with Gauguin to reconsider, and they seemed to reach some kind of an agreement. And so Gauguin wrote a second letter to Theo, withdrawing his decision to leave, and then he wrote to a friend, I'm staying here for now, but I'm poised to go at any moment. It rained nonstop the week before Christmas of 1888, leaving Vincent and Gauguin just cooped up inside to just pick at each other. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, just a few days after the absinthe incident, Vincent and Gauguin went to the art museum in Montpellier. And as they moved through the galleries, their bickering resumed. They argued about the works they saw. They argued about the merits of the different painters on display. And their dispute carried over into dinner, and once the dinner had finished, Gauguin got up from his meal and he left the table and he left the yellow house to go for a walk to clear his head, let things calm down. And Vincent wasn't sure if Gauguin had actually just left for good. And so in a blur of panic, he ran up to his bedroom and he picked up his straight razor and he followed Gauguin out into the dark streets. And as Gauguin was walking across the square toward the Rhone River, he heard somebody running up behind him. And Gauguin describes the confrontation like this. He says, "I heard behind me a well-known step, short, quick, irregular. I turned about on the instant as Vincent rushed toward me, an open razor in his hand. My look at that moment must have had great power in it, for he stopped and, lowering his head, set off running toward the house." Gauguin decided that he was going to spend the night in a hotel rather than return to a roommate who had just threatened his life. And so Vincent ran up to his room when he got back, and he stared at himself in the mirror as Gauguin is finding a place to stay, and he curses himself. And then he raises his blade, and he slashes off a significant portion of his left ear, severing his auricular artery, causing blood to spurt all over the walls and the floor. This is the drawing that the doctor made of the cut. He grabbed one of the linens that he had bought, especially for the yellow house, and he cut it into strips, sacramentally. Cut it into strips. And then he attempted to slow the bleeding. And after soaking those strips of yellow linen through with blood, he washed his amputated ear and he carefully wrapped it in an envelope that he had made of newspaper. And then he pulled his hat down over his head, though he was still bleeding. And he crossed the same circle where he had confronted Gauguin, and he went to the brothel that they would visit. And that week's Le Forum Républicain carried the story of what happened next. This is a picture of the story. It says this: "Last Sunday at 11:30 p.m., one Vincent Van Gogh painter of Dutch origin presented himself at the Maison de Tolerance No. 1 and asked for Rachel and gave her his ear, saying, 'Guard this object very carefully.' And then he disappeared. Rachel fainted when she opened the grisly package. The local postman, Vincent's friend, Joseph Roulin, found Vincent at the brothel. He was half conscious, he was delirious, he was still bleeding badly from his wound. The brothel was in an uproar, and word began to spread to the neighbors of Vincent's shocking appearance. And so Roulin walked Vincent home and put him in his bed. In the early morning hours of the next day, Christmas Eve, Virginia Chabad, who ran the brothel, took the parcel that Vincent had given to Rachel and showed it to a police officer who, upon confirming that it was indeed an ear, summoned his superior. The two officers went to the yellow house to look for Vincent, and they found the blood-soaked painter in his bed in a deep sleep. They called a doctor. Gauguin knew nothing about any of this until the next morning when he returned from his hotel to the yellow house to find a crowd of neighbors and police officers gathered on the street out front. And one bystander looked at him and asked him, "What have you done to your roommate?" Another told him Vincent was dead. Gauguin went upstairs as calmly as he could, and he found the police officers and the doctor next to Vincent, who was soaked in blood and sound asleep. And then Gauguin describes the moment. He says this: "In the bed lay Vincent, rolled up in the sheets, curled up in a ball. He seemed lifeless. Gently, very gently, I touched the body, the heat of which showed that he was still alive. And for me, it was as if I had suddenly gotten back all my energy, all my spirit. And then in a low voice, I said to the police commissioner, 'Be kind enough, monsieur, to awaken this man with great care. And if he asks for me, tell him I have left for Paris. The sight of me might prove fatal to him.'" Back in Paris, while Vincent was slicing off his ear, his brother Theo, who was his benefactor, the person who funded Vincent's entire life, was getting engaged. After finding Vincent alive, Gauguin telegrammed Theo. Theo had just finished writing this euphoric letter to his sister, telling her the good news about his engagement when Gauguin's message arrived. And so Theo wrote a short note to his fiancée, Joanna. And it said this: Vincent is gravely ill. I don't know what's wrong, but I shall have to go there, as my presence is required. I'm so sorry that you will be upset because of me, when instead I would just very much like to make you happy. Theo caught the 7:15 p.m. express train south, and he arrived in Arles on Christmas morning. He found Vincent in the hospital. Gauguin was still in town, but he had stayed away. Vincent asked Theo over and over and over, "Can I see Gauguin? Can I see Gauguin?" But Gauguin stayed away from Vincent for fear of upsetting him even further, and likely really to avoid any desperate pleas for him to stay. That night, Theo and Gauguin met, and they boarded a train together and headed back to Paris. And Vincent never saw Gauguin again. The last time he saw Gauguin was when he had the blade in his hand. When Vincent regained some lucidity, the doctor asked him about the incidents of December 23rd, and he claimed he didn't remember much. And when he was pressed as to why he gave his severed ear to Rachel, the only thing he said was that his reasons were, quote, quite personal. Certainly, in the agony of his own anxious mind, he blamed himself for driving Gauguin away. It wasn't just the end of a friendship that he so earnestly prized. It was also the end of a dream that he had for an artist colony in the south of France. Gayford said, quote, he was responsible for the terrible, solitary life that he led, isolated again now that Gauguin had left, and Vincent punished himself. The day after Christmas, while he was still in the hospital, Vincent learned that Theo and Gauguin had left, and he experienced a violent breakdown, and he had to be restrained in a straitjacket and locked in a solitary room. Roulin, the postman, took over the task of watching after Vincent, sending Theo regular updates. Vincent's condition was fragile. He remained weak and despondent. And after one particularly rough evening, Roulin wrote to Theo, he passed a very bad night, and they had to put him in an isolated room. He has taken no food and completely refused to talk. That is the exact state of your brother at present. Within a few days, to everybody's surprise, Vincent experienced a really rapid recovery. Though his doctor, Felix Ray, believed Vincent would always retain, quote, the extreme excitability that was the basis of his character, Vincent's mind cleared, and he asked about Gauguin and Theo, but not with the same desperation of the previous days, but with the concern of a man who knew that he had put them through an ordeal. And so a week later, on January 4th, Vincent's doctors allowed him to go make a short visit to the Yellow House. He walked into the flat, and he found Gauguin's room bare except for the furniture and the paintings that Vincent had supplied for his friend, including this famous chair that is Gauguin's chair. This time, Vincent didn't break down. Instead, what he did is he sat down at his little table, and he wrote a conciliatory letter to his friend, apologizing for his behavior and wishing him well. On January 7th, Dr. Ray felt that Vincent had stabilized, and he discharged him from the hospital. Vincent fared well enough at first, but not long after returning home in early March, he began acting erratically again. He became the object of his neighbors' ridicule and scorn. Some of his neighbors avoided him as though he was a dangerous man. Others sought him out so that they could mock him and throw things at him. And then there was a note, an article that described what happened. 81 venerable citizens of the town, 81, addressed a petition to the mayor of Arles with a view of putting an end to the turmoil. They requested that the madman should be removed and taken to an institution specifically designed for such people, for which they as citizens paid taxes. In truth, only 31 people signed the petition. It was inflated the story, but one of the signatures was Joseph Michel Genoux, the proprietor of the Café de Nut, Vincent's former landlord and friend and purveyor of absinthe. The mayor did his duty as a servant of the people, and he ordered that Vincent should be forcibly removed from the Yellow House and be committed to, quote, the section for lunatics in the hospital, where he was once again put into a rubber cell. The Yellow House was sealed by local officials until Theo could come and gather his brother's property, and Vincent never returned to the Yellow House after that. And so for all of this, you can buy a coffee mug where when you pour in a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes right before your eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. All right, why am I telling you this story? One of the most heartbreaking parts of Vincent's story is how often he struggled to remember his outbursts and his breakdowns. He just didn't remember them. Some parts of his brain was in a fog, perhaps from his drinking, maybe from lead poisoning, from ingesting paint, holding his brushes in his mouth. Any number of other reasons researchers have speculated about over the years. He just wasn't always aware of what he was doing. He didn't remember much about the night that he cut off his ear, though it is certainly one of the most common things we associate with him and his name today. Many people are more aware of his madness than his art. Be gentle. Be gentle, because this is a hard world. If the Lord in his kindness gives us the blessing of friendship, he is most certainly calling us to the holy work of burden bearing. To be a friend is to be a burden bearer. Stick around long enough in any relationship, and you will come to see more than the initial self-portraits offered. Gauguin presented himself as Jean Valjean, the aspirational vision of a man whose primary challenges came from the unjust world outside of him. And Vincent offered himself as a man who had mastered inner peace. Neither portrait was accurate, but are the portraits that we're inclined to lead with ever really true? Do they ever really tell the full story? To love someone is to move beyond first impressions into the heart of things. It is to take on the sacred work of stewarding another person's joy and stewarding another person's sorrow. To really know a person is in part to know them by their sorrows. Consider the ministry of Jesus. If you've spent much time in the scriptures, when I mention their names, you will know who I'm talking about. And they are all people who are known, at least in part, by their pain. Matthew the tax collector, Simon the leper, blind Bartimaeus, doubting Thomas, Judas the betrayer. There's the man with the withered hand. There's the woman caught in adultery. There's the boy with the unclean spirit. There's Talitha, the girl who had only been asleep. There's the widow from Nain. There's the rich young ruler. There's the woman with the issue of blood. There's the paralytic from Capernaum. There's the demoniac who lived among the tombs. There's the thief on the cross. We know them. And we know them by their failures. And we know them by their afflictions. And we know them by their sorrows. To know somebody by their pain is to know them by their need. Even the rich young ruler, whose pain was that he had outperformed everybody, he'd acquired great wealth in the process, had a long life ahead of him, and still felt a curious emptiness that nothing could seem to fill. What did he and the others need? They needed things like peace, rest, hope, forgiveness, freedom from affliction, deliverance. Our sorrows and our failures and our afflictions, my point is, are sacred. They're not shameful because they tell the truth about our need for the redeeming grace and mercy of Christ. And that's something that Christ alone can give, and he does. He gives it, and he gives it freely to anybody who would believe. But then, okay, what about us? What can we give? How do we care for, like Gauguin, the husband estranged from his family? Or Rachel, the woman who can be found at the brothel? Or Vincent, the painter with the severed ear? We can refuse to allow their pain to be the only thing we know them by. We can refuse to allow it to even be the main thing we know them by. And we can honor the truth that it is only the visibility of their suffering, not the presence of their suffering, but the visibility of their suffering that sets them apart from anybody else. We all suffer. We all suffer. And so we can guard their reputations. And we can remember through the example of their tears that they were created to hope. And they were created to hope in a joy that is unseen. And we can seek to remind them of the joy even as they remind us. And we can seek to know the beauty that they're contributing to the world and what they do with their vocational lives and what they do with their friendships and their relationships with their words. We can seek to know the beauty they're contributing to the world, which is made even more beautiful in the way that it kicks against the darkness in them. And then we can join them in that by making beauty of our own. And above all, we can just certainly refrain from purchasing that insulting mug. Thank you.